There is a strange period in life when nothing has changed, yet somewhere inside you, you know you are no longer the same person. Your job may still be the same. Your home looks exactly as it did yesterday. The same people may still expect the same version of you, and yet something has become difficult to ignore. You are less interested in proving yourself. Certain goals that once consumed you suddenly feel strangely empty. You find yourself thinking about things you buried years ago. You notice meaning in moments you would once have dismissed. And perhaps most unsettling of all, you begin to wonder, why do I feel different when my life looks exactly the same? Many people interpret this period as failure. They think they are stuck. They assume nothing is happening because nothing visible has changed. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the deepest changes in a person's life often begin before there is any outward evidence of them? Carl Jung spent much of his work exploring this strange territory, the point where an old identity begins to loosen before a new one has fully emerged. And Stoic philosophy offers an equally important lesson. You cannot always control what happens around you, but you can become conscious of what is happening within you. So perhaps a new season does not always announce itself with a new job, a new relationship, more money, or an obvious opportunity. Sometimes it begins with a quieter event. You begin becoming someone who can finally receive what comes next. Here are 6 signs that this process may already be happening. 1. You no longer see your old problems the same way. One of the first signs of inner change is surprisingly ordinary. The situation remains the same, but your interpretation of it changes. A few years ago, a failure might have made you think, my life is going nowhere. Now you may look at the same kind of failure and think, there is something here I need to understand. That difference matters. The event has not changed. You have. This is easy to underestimate because we are trained to measure progress through external evidence: a promotion, a house, a relationship, a financial milestone, a door opening. But psychological transformation often begins somewhere much less visible, in the meaning you assign to what happens. You lose an opportunity, and instead of immediately asking why life is against you, you become curious about what the experience is revealing. Someone rejects you, and instead of desperately trying to convince them of your worth, you begin asking why their approval mattered so much in the first place. A plan collapses, and although you are disappointed, you no longer automatically conclude that your future has collapsed with it. This is close to the Stoic practice of examining judgment. Epictetus taught that it is not simply the event itself that disturbs us, but the judgments we make about it. That does not mean pretending painful things are good. It means refusing to add unnecessary suffering to suffering. And something similar happens in Jungian psychology. As consciousness develops, you begin noticing the assumptions through which you have been living. You realize that perhaps the world did not suddenly become kinder. You simply stopped looking at everything through the same old wound. Maybe that is the first sign. Not that your circumstances have improved, but that you are becoming capable of meeting those circumstances differently. And sometimes that is the preparation that comes before everything else. 2. What once gave you purpose begins to lose its grip. Then something confusing may happen. The things you once desperately wanted no longer seem as important. Perhaps you spent years trying to impress people, building a career, making more money, being needed, being admired, being the person everyone could depend on. And for a long time, these pursuits gave you energy. Then one day, they don't. You still perform your responsibilities, you still show up, but something inside whispers, is this really what I want anymore? This can be frightening, because when an old goal loses its power, you may assume you have lost yourself. But sometimes you are not losing yourself. You are losing an identity that you built to survive an earlier chapter of your life. Think about someone who spent 20 years climbing a ladder because they believed reaching the top would finally make them feel worthy. Eventually, they reach a position they once dreamed about, and instead of feeling fulfilled, they feel strangely empty. The natural response is to blame themselves. What's wrong with me? But another possibility exists. Perhaps the goal did exactly what it was supposed to do. Perhaps it carried you through one season, and now you are being asked to live by something deeper. Jung described psychic energy as something that can shift its direction. What once absorbed your attention may gradually release its hold on you. This does not mean every fading interest is divine guidance. Sometimes you are simply tired. Sometimes you need rest. Sometimes a goal still matters, but your current approach does not. Discernment matters. But if you repeatedly notice that certain ambitions no longer match the person you are becoming, don't immediately force yourself back into the old identity. Stoicism asks a similar question: what is actually worth pursuing? Not what earns the most applause, not what makes you look successful, but what is consistent with the person you want to be. The strange emptiness you feel may not always be a void. Sometimes it is space. 3. Parts of yourself you abandoned begin returning. This can be one of the most uncomfortable signs. You begin meeting parts of yourself that you learned to suppress. Maybe you were taught to be agreeable, so you buried your anger. Maybe you became the responsible one, so you stopped admitting when you were exhausted. Maybe rejection taught you not to need anyone. Maybe criticism made you hide your creativity. Maybe you spent decades caring for everyone else and never asked what you wanted. Then, later in life, those forgotten desires begin returning. You suddenly want to write, to paint, to travel, to learn something completely new, to spend time alone, to say no, to speak honestly. And immediately, an old voice appears. You shouldn't want that. That's selfish. You're too old. What will people think? This is where Jung's idea of the shadow becomes useful. The shadow is not simply everything evil or shameful inside you. It can also contain qualities you rejected because they were inconvenient, unacceptable, or unsafe in the environment where you grew up. The person who was punished for speaking up may hide their strength. The person who was mocked for being sensitive may hide their emotional depth. The person who was expected to sacrifice may hide their desire for an independent life. Those qualities don't necessarily disappear, they wait. And when life becomes quieter, they sometimes begin asking to be acknowledged. This does not mean you should obey every impulse. Self-awareness is not the same as self-indulgence. This is where Stoicism becomes important. You do not have to act on every emotion. You learn to examine it. You can say, I feel angry, without becoming cruel. I want approval, without chasing it. I'm afraid of disappointing someone, without surrendering your values. The goal is not to become whatever you feel like becoming. The goal is to become conscious enough that your choices are no longer controlled by unconscious fear. That is a very different kind of freedom. 4. Certain coincidences suddenly feel meaningful. There are periods when ordinary events begin arriving with unusual timing. You have been thinking about changing careers, and an old friend unexpectedly contacts you about an opportunity. You have been struggling with a question for months, and then a book falls into your hands that addresses precisely that question. Someone says a sentence in passing, and it stays with you for days. Carl Jung called experiences like these synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem connected psychologically even when there is no obvious causal relationship. We should be careful here. Not every coincidence is a message from God. Not every number, encounter, or random event contains hidden meaning. If you start treating every coincidence as a command, you may lose judgment rather than gain wisdom. But sometimes, something happens that makes you stop. Not because it proves the universe has chosen your path for you, but because you are finally attentive enough to notice something you might previously have ignored. That distinction is important. A sign does not remove your responsibility. It does not make the decision for you. It simply gives you something worth considering. This is very close to Stoic discernment. You observe, you examine. You separate what is actually happening from what your emotions want it to mean. then you choose according to your values. Perhaps that is why meaningful moments become more noticeable when a person is changing internally. The world may not actually be speaking more loudly. You may simply be listening more carefully. 5. Silence stops frightening you. For years, many people avoid being alone with themselves. The moment the house becomes quiet, they reach for the phone. Another video, another message, another task, another distraction. Because silence has a strange habit of revealing things that noise allows us to avoid. When everything becomes quiet, you may suddenly notice how unhappy you have been, how exhausted you are, how much resentment you carry, how often you say yes when you mean no, how much of your life has been organized around other people's expectations. So naturally, silence can feel uncomfortable. But there may come a point when you stop running from it. You take a walk without your phone. You sit in your car for a few extra minutes before going inside. You spend an evening alone and don't feel the need to fill every second. And something changes. You begin hearing your own thoughts without immediately obeying them. This is valuable because Stoicism has never been about constantly controlling the outside world. It is about developing command over your inner responses. You cannot do that if you never give yourself enough quiet to notice them. Jung also understood solitude as an important part of psychological development. Not isolation, not withdrawing from everyone, but enough distance from external noise to encounter the person underneath your roles. The parent, the employee, the spouse, the provider, the dependable friend. Who are you when none of those roles are demanding something from you? That question can feel uncomfortable, but it can also become liberating. Sometimes life slows down, not because you are being punished. Sometimes the slower period gives you the opportunity to hear what a busier life kept drowning out. 6. You stop asking only what you will achieve and start asking who you are becoming. This may be the deepest sign of all. At some point, your questions change. Earlier in life, you may have asked, how much can I accomplish? How successful can I become? When will I finally have enough? When will other people recognize me? But after enough experience, another question begins to matter more. Who am I becoming? That question changes everything, because you can achieve something and still become smaller inside. You can become wealthy and become more afraid. You can become successful and become dependent on admiration. You can become respected while quietly losing respect for yourself. Achievement is not the enemy, but achievement without inner alignment can become another form of captivity. Jung called the movement toward a more integrated and authentic self-individuation. And while Jung's framework is psychological rather than a theological proof of divine guidance, the idea connects naturally with a spiritual question. What kind of person are you becoming through the life you are living? The answer is not found only in your accomplishments. It is found in how you respond when nobody is watching, how you treat someone who cannot benefit you, whether you can admit when you are wrong, whether you can say no without hatred, whether you can receive criticism without collapsing, whether you can succeed without becoming arrogant, whether you can fail without deciding that you are worthless. This is where Stoicism becomes practical. Your next season does not begin when everything finally goes your way. It begins when you become capable of meeting whatever comes next without abandoning yourself. Maybe your circumstances will change. Maybe they won't change as quickly as you hope. But you can change the person who meets them, and that may be the preparation you have been overlooking. Perhaps you have been waiting for proof that your life is moving, a new opportunity, a relationship, a financial breakthrough, a dramatic answer. But maybe the evidence has been quieter. You think differently now. You no longer chase what once consumed you. You are listening to parts of yourself you used to silence. You notice meaningful moments. You can tolerate silence. And you care less about what you can accumulate and more about who you are becoming. None of these things guarantees that a specific future will arrive. And they should never be used as excuses to ignore reality or avoid practical action. but they can tell you something important. You may not be stuck. You may be in transition. There is a difficult space between the person you were and the person you are becoming. The old identity no longer fits. The new one has not fully formed. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. Inside, everything is being reorganized. So if your life feels strangely quiet right now, don't rush to label it failure. If an old ambition has gone silent, don't immediately assume you have lost your purpose. If forgotten emotions are returning, don't assume you are moving backward. If you are becoming comfortable with solitude, don't mistake stillness for abandonment. And if you find yourself asking, "Who am I becoming?" instead of, "What else can I get?" pay attention. Because perhaps the new season you have been praying for is not beginning with a change in your circumstances. Perhaps it is beginning with a change in the person who will eventually walk into those circumstances. The Stoics understood something remarkably simple. You do not control when life changes. You control what you do with the person you are becoming while you wait. And perhaps faith asks for something similar. Not certainty about tomorrow, but the courage to remain awake today. So look carefully at your life, not only at what has changed. Look at what no longer has power over you. Look at what you are beginning to value. Look at what you can finally admit. Look at what you no longer need to prove. Those changes may not look impressive from the outside, but they may be the beginning of something much deeper. A new season does not always arrive like a door suddenly opening. Sometimes you only realize it has begun when you look back and understand that, for months or even years, you had already been becoming someone new. And perhaps that is why the silence felt so confusing. Nothing seemed to be happening, but you were changing. And sometimes the first evidence of a new life is not that your world looks different. It is that you no longer need the old world to tell you who you are. If this reflection stayed with you, watch the next video. It may help you understand another part of the quiet transformation that happens when you stop living for approval and begin living from within.